My name is Caroline Hayes. I am 42 years old. And if you ask my father what I do for a living, he'll still tell you with a proud little smirk that I file papers for the Navy and pour coffee for real officers. That's the story he's told neighbors, cousins, even strangers at the grocery store. For 2 decades, I've been reduced to a punchline. The truth? I wear stars on my shoulders. But for 20 years, in the walls of my own home, those stars have meant nothing. The last time it happened was at my nephew's birthday party. I had just driven 7 hours straight from Washington, D.C., where I'd spent the morning inside the Pentagon reviewing intelligence reports. I was still in my uniform, pressed, immaculate, when Dad clapped his hand on my back and said, "Here she is, my daughter the secretary. Best stapler in the fleet." Laughter rippled around the kitchen table. My sister Jessica rolled her eyes like she'd heard it 1,000 times before. My brother Mark, the so-called golden child, didn't even look up from his beer. Mom flinched, she always does, but stayed silent. She set another tray of food down and let Dad's words hang in the air like gospel truth. I didn't argue. I never do. You learn, after years of classified assignments, that silence is safer than explanations no one will believe. My work doesn't translate into cocktail party stories. I can't tell them about counterintelligence briefings or about flying halfway across the world on 48 hours' notice. So Dad filled the silence with his own version of my life. The harmless daughter who never quite measured up, the one who chose the safe desk job. It started the day I told him, at 17, that I had received my appointment to the Naval Academy. He laughed, actually laughed, and said, "So you'll be the one shining boots for the real sailors." That was the joke that stuck. Through plebe summer, through graduation, through deployments to the Middle East, through each promotion I earned with sweat and blood, Dad never updated the script. He kept repeating the same line like it was carved in stone. Caroline the secretary. Caroline the helper. Jessica fed that narrative like gasoline on a flame. She became a corporate lawyer, the one Dad bragged about at church luncheons. Mark became a high school football coach, a local hero with newspaper clippings framed on Dad's office wall. And me? I was the ghost in uniform. The daughter who showed up late to holidays, slipped in quietly, then got turned into the family joke. The hurt isn't the laughter, it's the dismissal, the refusal to see me. Sometimes I think Dad decided early on who his kids were, and nothing we did could change his mind. Jessica, the brilliant star. Mark, the athlete. Caroline, the secretary. He locked the 3 of us into roles like characters in a play, and then forced us to perform those parts for the rest of our lives. I should be used to it by now, but humiliation never dulls. Each joke lands like a slap, and the worst part is Mom's silence. She could stop him, correct him, tell the truth. She doesn't. She just sets the table, clears the plates, and changes the subject. That's why, when my phone rang one Friday afternoon and Jessica's number flashed on the screen, my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. I was buried in work, another stack of briefings waiting on my desk. But something in my gut told me to answer. Her voice was trembling. "Caroline, it's Mark. You need to come home, now." I froze. Jessica never called me unless she wanted to borrow money or make some passive remark about me missing another family dinner. Her voice had never sounded like this, broken, frantic. "What happened?" I asked, already feeling the knot in my stomach tighten. "Federal charges," she whispered. "Something about the foundation funds. They raided his house this morning. The FBI, Dad won't come out of his office. Mom can't stop crying. Caroline, I don't know what to do." I closed my eyes, the weight of 20 years of silence pressing down on me. The golden child, Dad's pride, had fallen. And whether my family liked it or not, they were about to learn the truth. I wasn't the secretary. I was the one person who understood exactly how deep this hole went. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to stay silent. The drive from Washington, D.C., to my hometown of Dayton, Ohio, was 6.5 hours. I made it in 5. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel the entire way, my mind running in endless loops of worst-case scenarios. I'd been through crises before, terror alerts, intelligence leaks, military tribunals, but nothing twists your stomach like hearing that your own brother has been dragged out of his home in handcuffs. When I finally pulled into my parents' driveway just past midnight, the house looked smaller than I remembered. Childhood homes always shrink when you come back as an adult, but tonight it looked weighed down, sagging under the gravity of disgrace. The porch light was on. A half-dozen newspapers were piled at the foot of the steps, ignored. I opened the door without knocking. The smell hit me first: burnt coffee, old carpet, the faint tang of cigarette smoke Dad always tried to hide. Mom sat at the kitchen table, hunched over a cold cup, staring at nothing. Her hair looked thinner, grayer than the last time I saw her. She looked up and for a second her face softened. "Caroline," she whispered. She rose slowly, almost stumbling, and wrapped her arms around me. She held on longer than usual, like I was the last rope keeping her from sinking. Dad was at the table too, but he didn't stand. His tie was loose, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes bloodshot. He stared past me, fixed on some invisible point in the wallpaper. "You came," he muttered. Not gratitude, not relief, just fact, like I'd been summoned and had finally arrived. "Where's Jess?" I asked. "Putting the kids to bed," Mom said, wiping her eyes. "She drove down as soon as she heard. She's a mess." I sat down. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. Finally, Dad spoke. "They're saying things about your brother that can't be true." His voice cracked on the last word. "Stealing from children, from a youth program, Mark would never." I let the words settle. I'd seen this kind of denial before, soldiers insisting their buddy couldn't have gone rogue, politicians swearing their aide would never take bribes. It was the first stage of every fall from grace. Disbelief clung to like a life raft. "Dad," I said carefully, "the FBI doesn't raid a man's house without cause if they brought charges." He snapped his head toward me, his eyes finally locking onto mine, burning with the old contempt. "And what would you know about it? Filing paperwork doesn't make you an expert on federal crimes. Your brother ran a multi-million-dollar foundation. Real responsibility, real work. The old script, the same dismissal, even now in the middle of disaster. It should have stung, but after years of absorbing those blows, it barely made a dent." "Dad, I know more than you think," I said quietly. He scoffed, muttered something under his breath, and turned away. The next morning, the circus arrived. By 7 a.m., reporters crowded the sidewalk outside the house. News vans lined the street. Microphones and cameras waited for anyone willing to talk. I peeked through the curtains and saw a front-page headline pressed against the glass. "Local hero coach accused of $2, 3 million fraud." Mom gasped when she saw it. Jessica stormed into the kitchen a few minutes later, her mascara streaked, her phone buzzing with calls she kept ignoring. Her husband trailed behind her, stone-faced, carrying a stack of newspapers he'd snatched from the front lawn. Their 2 teenagers hovered in the hallway, confused and frightened. "What are we going to do?" Jessica demanded, slamming her phone on the counter. "The lawyers want 60 grand just for a retainer. Mark's contract is suspended. Sarah's friends at school are already asking questions. This is a nightmare." Mom pressed her hands together like she was praying. Dad sat stiffly, staring at the floor. He looked 10 years older than yesterday. "Jake's a good man," Dad muttered, his voice low. "He wouldn't steal from kids." Jessica whipped around to glare at me. "Caroline, say something. You're just sitting there like you don't even care." "I do care," I said, choosing my words slowly. "But the evidence—" "What evidence?" she snapped. "You don't know anything about this. You're not a lawyer, you're not." She stopped, but the implication was clear. Not important, not relevant, not one of them. I took a breath, biting down the instinct to unload 20 years of truth right there on the linoleum floor. Not yet. Timing matters in courtrooms and in families. Instead, I stood. I need some air. I stepped outside, past the reporters shouting questions, past the flashing cameras, and pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over a number I hadn't dialed in years, a direct line to someone at the bureau. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family thought I was the least qualified to help. In reality, I was the only one who understood exactly how deep Mark's trouble ran. And if things kept spiraling, the moment of revelation was going to come whether I wanted it or not. The courthouse in Columbus was already buzzing when we arrived. The air outside smelled of exhaust, cigarette smoke, and fear. Reporters lined the steps, cameras flashing like lightning every time my brother Mark was escorted inside by his attorney. The man who once had his picture plastered on the walls of every high school gym in Ohio now ducked his head like a criminal trying to outrun the storm. Mom clutched her rosary so tightly her knuckles turned white. Jessica walked ahead, her jaw set, whispering to her husband about strategy, about optics, about what people were saying online. Dad, as always, was immovable stone, wearing his best suit and the same stubborn expression I'd grown up with. This family is untouchable. Inside, the courtroom felt smaller than I expected. Wooden benches, stale air, the American flag drooping in one corner. The judge took her seat with a sharp rap of the gavel, and the trial began. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out spreadsheets, bank transfers, fabricated invoices, all pointing to the same truth. Over 3 years, Mark had siphoned more than $2 million from the Youth Athletics Foundation, money meant to buy equipment for underprivileged kids. Money that had instead paid for a new boat, a vacation home in Florida, and the kind of luxury cars that didn't fit in our modest neighborhood. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer. I could see Dad shrinking a little more with every exhibit. Mom's lips moved silently, her prayers desperate and unending. Jessica leaned close to me and hissed, "This is bad. This is really bad." Then, with that same edge she's always saved for me, she added, "Not that you'd understand." I turned my head slowly. "What do you mean by that?" She gave me a tight smile. "Caroline, this is serious federal law. You're not equipped for this. Filing reports isn't the same as understanding how to fight in court. Leave this to people who actually know what they are doing." There it was again, the dismissal, sharpened by panic but unchanged in essence. 20 years of being minimized boiled in my chest, but I swallowed it down. Timing, always timing. Across the aisle, the defense attorney, slick suit, gelled hair, a man named Peterson, stood and tried to poke holes in the government's case. He suggested sloppy accounting, overzealous investigators, vendettas against a beloved coach. But the jury's eyes told me they weren't buying it. They leaned forward when the prosecutors spoke. They scribbled notes furiously when FBI agents took the stand. On the third day, things came to a head. The prosecution called their final witness, Special Agent Harrison, a young, precise man with a calm voice that carried through the entire room. He explained, step by step, how the investigation began, how funds were tracked, how false vendors were created. His testimony was devastating, airtight. When it was Peterson's turn to cross-examine, he smirked, the way lawyers do when they think they've found a crack. "Agent Harrison," he drawled, "isn't it true that this investigation was handled primarily by junior agents with little experience in complex financial crimes?" "No, counselor," Harrison replied evenly. "This case was supervised at the highest levels." Peterson raised an eyebrow. "By whom?" That's when Harrison's gaze flicked, just for a moment, toward the gallery, toward me. "The investigation," he said clearly, "was overseen by Rear Admiral Caroline Hayes, director of the Navy's Financial Crimes Division. Admiral Hayes has over 20 years of experience in military criminal investigations and has personally supervised cases involving billions of dollars in assets. The words hung in the air like a detonation. The courtroom went silent. I felt every head turn. Jessica froze, her pen slipping from her fingers. Mom's rosary clattered to the floor. Dad's face drained of color, then flushed a violent red. But Peterson, he stammered. His swagger collapsed. An admiral? He muttered like the word itself was foreign. Harrison didn't waver. Yes, sir, an admiral. The judge inclined her head respectfully toward me before turning back to the defense. Counselor, do you have further questions? Peterson swallowed hard. No, Your Honor. The prosecution rested their case. And just like that, the balance of the entire room shifted. For 20 years, I'd been the secretary, the helper, the joke. But in that moment, in that quiet Ohio courtroom, the truth finally pierced through the layers of denial and dismissal. My family sat stunned, like strangers who just realized they'd been living with a ghost. And I, for the first time in decades, didn't need to stay silent. The gavel struck again, dismissing the court for lunch recess. But no one moved. It was as if the entire room had been knocked breathless. The only sound was the faint shuffle of papers as the court clerk gathered exhibits. I rose slowly, straightening my uniform. The weight of the insignia on my shoulders had never felt heavier or more liberating. For years, I'd carried those stars in silence. Now, every eye in the room was on them. Dad looked like a man struck by lightning. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Jessica sat rigid, blinking like she could rewind the last 10 minutes and erase what she'd just heard. Mom pressed both hands against her chest, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. I walked toward the aisle, but before I could reach the door, Dad's voice cracked through the hush. Admiral? He stumbled on the word. You're an admiral? I turned to face him. Rear Admiral, I said quietly. For the last 18 months, the color drained completely from his face. He gripped the wooden bench so hard his knuckles looked ready to split. The man who had spent 24 years reducing me to a joke was finally choking on the truth. Jessica found her voice next, high-pitched and shaking. You let us believe, she stopped, shaking her head furiously. All this time, you let us think you were filing papers. Why didn't you just tell us? I met her eyes. I did tell you. When I made lieutenant commander, when I got my own command, when I was promoted to captain, I called, I wrote, I tried, but you didn't want to hear it. You laughed, you dismissed it, you made it a joke. Her face flushed red, a mixture of shame and fury. Mom stood slowly, gripping the back of the bench for balance. Oh, Caroline, her voice cracked, her sobs no longer quiet. What have we done? I couldn't answer, because what had they done? For 2 decades, they'd taken every sacrifice, every honor, every sleepless night I'd given to this country and boiled it down to a punchline. And I had let them. The bailiff called for recess again, urging people to clear the room. My family followed me into the hallway, their emotions spilling like broken glass across the floor. Dad cornered me first, his voice low and raw. Why didn't you stop me? His eyes, once full of smug certainty, now brimmed with desperation. All those years, Caroline, why didn't you tell me I was wrong? I clenched my jaw. Because you never listened. The few times I tried, you brushed it off. You changed the subject. You doubled down on your story, and eventually I stopped trying. He shook his head like he couldn't bear the reflection in the mirror. All those jokes, all those times I introduced you as my secretary, his voice broke. God help me. Jessica cut in, her tone sharp, defensive, like she could still control the narrative. So what now? You expect us to just bow down, call you Admiral and forget the last 20 years. I fixed her with a steady look. I don't expect anything. Not apology, not admiration. I know who I am. My sailors know, the Pentagon knows, the President himself knows. Whether you choose to see it, that's on you. The words landed heavy, Jessica recoiled as if slapped. Mom stepped closer, her tears streaking her cheeks. She reached out, trembling fingers brushing my sleeve. "We were so blind," she whispered. "So proud of Mark, so eager to laugh with your father, and all along you were—" She couldn't finish. Her voice dissolved into sobs. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the invisible middle child. I felt seen, terribly, painfully seen. The irony was cruel. The only reason my family had finally recognized me was because my brother had fallen. His disgrace had ripped open the door I'd been knocking on all my life. I stood taller, meeting their eyes one by one. The truth was always there, you just didn't want it. Silence fell. The kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from wounds freshly opened. Somewhere down the hall, the court officers called for everyone to return. The trial wasn't over, not for Mark, not for us. But one thing was certain, nothing in this family would ever be the same again. The courtroom was packed tighter than ever on sentencing day. Reporters filled the back rows, whispering into phones and scribbling notes. Neighbors, old teammates, even former students of Mark's football program had crowded in to watch their local heroes fall. The tension was so thick you could feel it pressing against your skin. Mark sat at the defense table, jaw clenched, his once broad shoulders slumped beneath the weight of weeks of testimony. His attorney, Peterson, looked less polished than before, his suit wrinkled, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. Across the aisle, the prosecution team waited calmly, their evidence airtight and unshaken. When the judge entered, the room rose, then sat in heavy silence as she adjusted her glasses and began to read. On the charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, her voice was steady, each word a hammer strike. The jury has found the defendant, Mark Hayes, guilty on all counts. The air seemed to leave the room. Mom gasped, clutching her rosary so hard the beads snapped, scattering across the wooden floor. Jessica covered her face, shaking her head in disbelief. Dad sat frozen, his mouth half open, as if he'd just watched the ground collapse beneath him. The judge continued. "It is the sentence of this court that the defendant serve 4 years in federal prison and pay full restitution of $3 million to the Youth Athletics Foundation." Mark's head dropped into his hands. His entire body shook, not from tears, but from the collapse of a life built on lies. When the bailiff approached to cuff him, he didn't resist. "Coach Hayes," the bailiff said almost softly, as if acknowledging who Mark had once been. Then the chains clicked shut around his wrists. The sight of my brother, once the golden boy, the pride of our father, being led out in handcuffs was almost unbearable. Dad finally broke. His shoulders heaved, his eyes wet, the proud man who had once laughed at me in uniform now sobbing openly as his son disappeared through the courtroom doors. Outside, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved forward, questions hurled like stones. Jessica shielded her children, Mom wept openly, and Dad, red-eyed, broken, stood in the center of the storm. He turned toward me. For the first time in my life, his gaze didn't hold mockery or dismissal. It held recognition, and something else, regret. "Caroline," he said, his voice rough and trembling. He hesitated, then corrected himself. "Rear Admiral Hayes." The word stunned me more than the verdict. His voice cracked. "I need you to know all those years, all those things I said, I didn't understand. I was scared. Scared of losing you. Scared you'd leave and never come back, so I made it smaller. I made you smaller. And I never should have." The hallway was crowded, buzzing with reporters and strangers, but in that moment it felt like it was just the two of us. I took a long breath. "Dad, I never needed your pride to know my worth, but hearing it now, it means more than you know." He nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Rear Admiral, my daughter." Mom stepped forward then, wrapping both of us in her arms. For the first time in decades, I felt my family's walls crack, not all the way, but enough for light to slip through. Later, as I drove back to Washington, the courthouse fading in my rearview mirror, the weight I'd carried for 24 years felt lighter. My family had finally seen me, not the secretary, not the joke, but the woman I truly was. 3 months later, Dad called me at the Pentagon for the very first time. His voice, formal at first, carried a quiet pride. "Is this Admiral Hayes?" "Yes," I answered, smiling. "This is your father. I was wondering if you might come to the Rotary dinner next week. I'd like to introduce you properly this time." I looked out at the courtyard where men and women in uniform marched with purpose, and my heart softened. "I'd like that, Dad," I said. "I'd like that very much." Sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from battlefields. They come from the people sitting across your own dinner table, the ones who should see you most clearly. For 24 years, Caroline Hayes lived in the shadows of dismissal, mocked as nothing more than a secretary in uniform. But the truth, like light through stained glass, has a way of breaking through. Her father's tears in that courthouse hallway did not erase the pain, but they did something almost as powerful. They began to heal it. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't humiliation, it's recognition. It's letting those who doubted you finally see the person you always were. And that, perhaps, is the heart of this story. Not triumph over enemies, but reconciliation with family. Not just earning respect, but reclaiming it. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on your own family, your own battles, your own silent victories, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with your thoughts because your voice matters. And if you want to hear more stories of strength, resilience, and truth, subscribe to this channel. Every click, every like, every share helps these stories reach someone who might be walking through their own storm. Because in the end, we are all fighting to be seen.